In their saddlebags, the vaqueros always carried something that could keep a man in the saddle for 3 weeks. No fire, no cooking, just a handful of food when the sun burned everything around and the water in the goat skin was running low. These men knew something most of us have forgotten today. Food wasn't about taste, it was about survival, about making it through the next 100 miles when all you had was dust, heat, and a herd that didn't care whether you lived or died. This isn't the tacos you see in restaurants. This isn't the Mexico you know from vacation. This is the American Southwest in the 1800s, and the men who worked this land ate things that would shock you today. Some of it was brilliant, some of it came from desperation, but all of it was real. Let's talk about what the vaqueros actually ate. Machaca, dried beef. They cut the meat into thin slabs and dried it under the brutal sun until it became harder than leather. Then they pounded it, breaking it into fibers with rocks. This wasn't done in a kitchen, it was done outside, in the heat, with whatever tools they had. This dried beef lasted for months without refrigeration, weighed little, and packed so much protein that a man stayed strong even when fresh food was nowhere to be found. When it was time to eat, they threw the machaca into a skillet with fat. The meat came back to life. It sizzled, it softened, and it filled their bellies after a long day in the saddle. The smell of machaca cooking over a campfire meant the day was almost done. It meant rest was coming. For men who worked from dawn until dark, that smell was everything. This wasn't jerky in the modern sense. This was survival packed into every bite, and it tasted like smoke, salt, and the open range. Every vaquero knew how to make machaca, and every vaquero depended on it.
Carne asada on mesquite coals. No marinades, no spices, just meat, salt, and fire. The vaqueros didn't have time for complicated cooking. They threw the beef straight onto the coals of mesquite wood. The flames licked the edges, the smoke soaked into every piece, and when the meat was done, they ate it with their hands. No plates, no forks, just a knife to cut and fingers to hold. The smoke from mesquite gave a flavor you can't get anywhere else. Earthy, deep, with almost sweet notes mixed with the char from the fire. This was food born from the land itself, from the trees of the desert and the cattle that survived on tough brush. Simple, fast, and it tasted like the desert. When you eat carne asada prepared this way, you're tasting the same meal that generations of vaqueros ate before you, their fathers and their grandfathers.
Chile seco, dried chili steep. When the meat was running low, they turned to the chilies. Dried red chilies from last year's harvest, hard as wood but full of flavor. They hung in bundles from the rafters of ranch houses, surviving winter, spring, and the long hot summer when everything else spoiled. They dropped them into hot water and let them steep. The chilies softened, the water turned dark and rich, and they soaked bread in it or poured it over whatever meat they had left. Sometimes they drank the chili water straight. It warmed them on cold desert nights when the temperature dropped and the wind cut through their blankets. It wasn't much, but it reminded them of home, of their mother's kitchen, of harvest time, of the smell of chilies roasting over an open fire. The vaqueros carried dried chilies in their saddlebags. They were light, they didn't spoil, and they turned plain food into something worth eating.
Pinole. This was the food I told you about at the start, the one that saved lives. Pinole was toasted corn ground into powder and mixed with a little sugar or honey. The vaqueros carried it in small bags tied to their saddles. Leather or cloth protected it from moisture. When there was no time to stop and build a fire, they reached into the bag and ate it by the handful. Pinole gave them energy, kept them moving, and never went bad. One handful could keep a man going for hours, and on a long cattle drive, that was everything. They ate it dry, they mixed it with water to make a thick drink. Sometimes they stirred it into hot coffee when they had it. The taste was sweet and earthy, like toasted grain with a hint of honey. It stuck to the roof of your mouth, but it filled your stomach. And when you were hours from the next meal, that sticky sweetness was exactly what you needed. This was survival food at its finest, and it kept the vaqueros alive when nothing else could.
Flour tortillas. Many people think Mexican food always starts with corn tortillas, but in the north, where the vaqueros worked, wheat was king. The Spanish brought wheat to northern Mexico, and it grew better there than corn. The soil and climate were different. The people adapted and started making simple flatbreads from flour and water. No yeast, no rising time. They rolled out the dough and threw it on a hot stone or skillet. It sizzled, puffed up in places, and got dark spots where it touched the hottest parts. Fast, filling, it went with everything. The northern vaqueros knew this bread better than anyone. They ate it with beans, with meat, with chili sauce, or just plain with a pinch of salt. This wasn't restaurant food. This was working food. It kept a man strong through 12-hour days in the saddle. Every vaquero knew how to make it. Even the young boys learned early.
Salt-cured beef strips. This wasn't the jerky you buy in a package today. This was tougher, saltier, made to last for weeks without refrigeration. They rubbed the beef with coarse salt and left it in the sun. The meat hardened, became so tough it made your jaw ache, but that didn't matter. The salt pulled out all the moisture, kept it from spoiling, and you could carry such a supply for a month and it would still be edible. They wrapped the strips in cloth and forgot about them until the food ran out. When you were 3 days from the nearest town and supplies were low, you didn't think about toughness. You chewed until your jaw hurt, and you were grateful for every piece. Some men soaked the meat in water to soften it. Others gnawed it dry. This food asked only for patience, and the vaqueros had plenty of that.
Manteca fried dough rounds. Sometimes at the end of a long day, they wanted something warm and simple. They made dough from flour and water, rolled it into rounds, and fried it in manteca, pork fat. The dough puffed up, turned golden, and gave a feeling of fullness that only fat and heat can create. You could hear the sizzling across the camp. The smell carried for 100 steps, and when the rounds came out of the skillet, dripping with fat and steaming, every man wanted one. They ate them plain, with a little salt, sometimes with a drizzle of honey. Not fancy, but after 12 hours in the saddle, it felt like a gift. In those moments, it reminded them that food doesn't have to be complicated to be good. Simplicity, fat, and warmth could make a hard day a little easier. The vaqueros made these on rest days, on pay days, when the work was done and they had a little extra time. Onion and green chili skillet scramble. When the vaqueros had fresh vegetables, they didn't waste time. They sliced onions and green chilies and threw them into a hot skillet with a little fat. It cooked fast. The onions softened, the chilies blistered, and the smell spread through camp, and men would stop just to breathe it in. If they were near a ranch, they added eggs, and the food turned into a golden soft mass. But even without eggs, it was good. Sweet, spicy, satisfying. This was a working man's breakfast. Quick, hot, real. It didn't require fancy ingredients, and it gave you strength for the next 12 hours. They ate it straight from the skillet, scooping it up with a flatbread. This was food that reminded them that vegetables were a gift from the land, something more than dust and thorns.
Mesquite roasted small game. The vaqueros didn't always have beef. Sometimes they had to hunt. Rabbits, quail, whatever they could catch in traps or shoot when ammunition was available. When they caught something, they cooked it whole over mesquite coals. No cleaning, no fuss, just the animal, fire, and patience. They speared the carcass on a stick and held it over the flames. The skin blackened, fat dripped into the coals, making them flare up, and slowly the meat cooked through. The smoke from the mesquite soaked into it down to the bone. When it was done, they tore it apart with their hands and ate everything: the legs, the breast, the organs, even cracking the bones to get at the marrow inside. This was food that connected a man to the land, to the animals that survived in the same desert where the vaqueros themselves worked. And it tasted wild, smoky, real. Broth from hooves and bones. When the meat was completely gone, they turned to the parts people usually throw away: hooves, bones, scraps. They boiled them for hours. The water became thick and rich, full of gelatin. Not pretty, but edible. And when there was no other choice, this was food that saved lives. If the broth cooled, it turned into jelly. When reheated, it became liquid again. They drank it straight, soaked bread in it, mixed it with whatever vegetables they had left. The taste was faint, but it reminded them of meat. The vaqueros knew how to squeeze everything out of an animal. Out in the desert, throwing away bones meant throwing away food. They boiled, they simmered, until there was nothing left that could give them strength. This wasn't the kind of food you bragged about, but it was the kind that kept you alive. Red chili fat sauce. This was pure pleasure in a world where food was often just about survival. Dried red chilies were ground into a paste and mixed with fat. No meat, just heat and richness. The vaqueros made this sauce in big batches when they had time. They toasted the chilies first, then pounded them with a stone into powder, and mixed the powder with melted fat until it became a thick red paste. They poured it over rice, beans, tortillas. Everything became tastier. When food was bland or scarce, this sauce brought it back to life. The heat of the chilies woke you up. The fat made the texture smooth and satisfying. Together, they turned plain food into something you actually wanted to eat. The recipe has hardly changed since then. It was perfect from the first time. The vaqueros carried small clay pots of this sauce, sealed with wax. When they opened one, the smell filled the air, smoky, spicy, deep. It reminded them of home, of family meals. And out on the trail, such reminders were worth more than gold. Cold milk and crumbled bread supper. Sometimes at the end of the day, the vaqueros had no energy left even for a fire. So they poured cold milk into a bowl, crumbled bread into it, and ate. Simple, but after a long day under the sun, it was cool, filling, and enough. Food for men whose hands ached from holding reins, whose backs hurt from the saddle, whose eyes burned from the sun. They didn't want to build a fire or stand over a hot skillet. They just wanted to eat and sleep. The milk, if they were near a ranch, might still be warm, straight from the cow. If it had sat in a clay jar, it would be cool and slightly sour. The bread soaked in the milk, turning into a soft mush that barely needed chewing. This food asked nothing in return, and when you were exhausted to the limit, that kind of simplicity was exactly what you needed. Fire-blistered squash with salt. They took whole squash and buried them in the coals of the fire. The skin charred, the inside softened, and when they pulled them out, they cracked them open and ate the flesh with a little salt. No knife needed, no plate either. They scooped out the orange or yellow flesh with their fingers. It tasted smoky, sweet, almost creamy. This reminded them that food wasn't only about meat, that vegetables could give just as much satisfaction and joy. Some mashed the roasted squash and mixed it with chili or fat, but most of the time they ate it plain, with gratitude to the land that showed its generosity during harvest season. Roasted pumpkin seeds. When they cut open squash or pumpkins, they saved the seeds. They washed them, dried them on a stone by the fire, and roasted them until they turned crunchy and golden. These were trail snacks, portable protein that smelled like fall, even in the desert heat. They cracked the seeds on the go, poured them into a pocket, and ate them between tasks.
Some salted them, some sprinkled on chili, others left them plain. This simple thing proved a truth. Nothing went to waste, not even what others would throw away. In the world of the vaqueros, there was no such thing as waste.
Leftover meat wrapped in cloth and reheated in coals. If there was meat left over from the night before, they didn't just leave it. They wrapped it in clean cloth, tied it tightly, and in the morning buried it in the still warm coals. The method was simple but worked without fail. The cloth kept the meat from burning, the coals warmed it evenly, and breakfast was hot without building a new fire. The vaqueros learned to think ahead, to make the next day a little easier by spending a little time today. When they unwrapped the bundle, they found meat that was steaming, tender, and sometimes even better than the night before. The flavors had melded together overnight. This method was never written down. It was passed from the old to the young, and it worked for decades without changing.
Goat meat simmered plain for ranch crews. On some ranches, they didn't slaughter cattle. The steers were too valuable. But goats they butchered often. Their meat was boiled in plain water with a pinch of salt. No spices, no extras, just meat, fire, and water. Goat meat was tougher than beef, with a stronger taste, but it was food. And when you worked from sunrise to sunset, that's all that mattered. Goat meat took longer to cook, but after a few hours it became tender enough to eat. The vaqueros didn't complain about it. They ate what they were given because complaining never filled a stomach. The goat meat was eaten with bread, with rice, and the bones were saved for broth later.
Tallow-cooked rice. Rice wasn't common on the trail, but when they had it, they cooked it the simplest way possible, in rendered beef fat, tallow. No seasoning, no vegetables, just rice and fat. This was pure calories, pure energy, and such food stuck to the ribs like nothing else. The fat melted in the pot, the rice went in, and every grain soaked up that rich beef flavor. The rice turned golden, slightly crispy on the bottom where it touched the hot pot, and soft and fluffy on top. They ate this when a long drive lay ahead, when they needed to store up strength for many hours. Not fancy, but reliable. Sometimes they added salt, but most of the time they did without. Simple cheese melted on hot stones. When the vaqueros worked near a ranch, they sometimes had fresh cheese, soft, crumbly, made that same morning. They heated stones in the fire, placed the cheese on them, and watched it melt. Then they ate it, scooping it up with a flatbread or just with their fingers. This was one of the few pleasures they had, and they savored it. The cheese melted slowly, bubbled, the edges browned, and the smell spread so that even the toughest men would start to smile. Such moments didn't come every day. When work ended early, when the ranch owner was in a good mood, when his wife sent extra cheese down to the men. On those days, they ate it slowly, trying to make it last, because tomorrow it would be back to beans and dried meat.
Town-made stew bowls sold to vaqueros near the corrals. When the vaqueros finally made it to town, they had no energy for cooking. Near the stockyards, there were always women selling cheap stew in bowls. Meat, vegetables, broth, what did it matter what was in it? The important thing was that it was hot, ready, and cheap. The vaqueros lined up, ate standing, and went back to work. No one asked what was in the stew. They paid their coins and ate. This taste was the taste of civilization to them. Someone else had built the fire, chopped, cooked. After weeks in the saddle, that was worth everything. The men gathered in groups, ate, talked, laughed. For a few minutes, life felt easier.
Burnt sugar water drink. When energy was low and there was no food, they turned to sugar. They heated it in a skillet until it darkened and began to smoke, then poured water over it. The result was a sweet drink that gave a quick burst of energy. This wasn't a treat, it was desperation in a cup. The sugar bubbled, turned black, the water hissed,
and when the drink cooled enough to swallow, they downed it fast. The sweet warmth spread through the body almost instantly. Their hands stopped shaking, their vision cleared, and they found the strength to work a little longer, to hold on for a few more hours. The vaqueros didn't like this drink. It meant things were bad, that supplies were running out. But they made it again and again because survival meant finding strength where none was left. Cold beans mashed with fat for travel. Beans were cooked in large pots, but you couldn't carry a pot of hot stew on the trail. So cooled beans were mashed with fat, packed tightly and wrapped in cloth. They ate them cold, straight from the bundle without reheating. Not pretty, but practical. And on the trail, that was what mattered. The fat kept the mixture from drying out, added calories, and made the taste rich enough to eat without complaint. The vaqueros broke off a piece and chewed it right in the saddle when there was no time to stop, when the cattle were moving and they had to move with them. Such beans were dense, heavy, and left a man feeling full for a long time. Simple, portable, reliable. Flour dumplings dropped into meat water. When the meat was almost gone but the broth was still rich, they made dumplings. Flour and water were rolled into balls and dropped into the boiling pot. The dumplings soaked up the flavor, swelled up, and from a small piece of meat, they made a meal that could feed 5 men. The vaqueros knew how to turn almost nothing into something. The little balls of dough floated in the broth, growing bigger, turning from hard lumps into soft, meat-flavored pillows. This was the food of the end of the week, when supplies were running low, when you had to stretch the leftovers. No one complained about dumplings. On the contrary, they were glad to have them, because a cook who could make a proper meal from flour and water was worth his weight in gold. Green chilies roasted in the fire. Not as a topping, not as a side, this was the meal itself. Fresh green chilies were thrown straight into the coals, the skin blistered, blackened, and the flesh inside softened, soaking up the smoke. Then they peeled off the charred skin and ate them with their hands, whole, with nothing else. First the heat hit, making your eyes water, but then came the smoky, sweet, earthy taste. These were moments when the land gave something green and alive. They ate such chilies in the evening, sitting by the fire, passing them to each other, laughing when someone got an especially hot one. In those minutes, food was no longer just fuel, it was a reason to be together.
Dried fruit soaked overnight. When they could afford it, the vaqueros bought dried apples, peaches, apricots, hard as rocks. They soaked them in water in the evening, and by morning, the fruit had swelled, become soft, almost fresh and sweet. This was a rare treat, a taste far removed from salt and smoke, and they looked forward to it with special anticipation. The fruit absorbed the water, and the water itself turned sweet and golden. Every piece of rehydrated fruit reminded them of summer, of orchards, of home. They saved such food for the hardest days, so they could wake up in the morning with hope. They also drank the water in which the fruit had soaked. It was sweet too, and valued no less. Final mixed pot at the end of the drive. When the cattle drive was coming to an end, before heading into town to restock supplies, the vaqueros made one last communal meal. Into a single pot went everything that was left: beans, dried meat, chiles, rice, any scraps. It became a thick, humble mixture, but it was shared. Each man added what he could, and each ate from the same pot. The smells blended: smoke, chile, meat, grain. It didn't smell fancy, but it smelled of completion, of the end of a hard journey, of rest soon to come. Tired, dusty, sunburned men gathered around the fire. Some ladled the stew into bowls, others ate straight from the pot. They spoke little, too exhausted, but they sat together, and that mattered. They had traveled hundreds of miles side by side, worked, endured, and now they were eating from one pot. This was food that said, "You made it, you survived." When the pot was empty, they kicked dirt over the coals, saddled their horses, and rode into town to collect their pay, only to start the next drive in a few days. Such was their life, and they wouldn't have traded it for any other.